Greetings from the International Labour Organization and its Cooperatives unit, where we mark its centenary this year, 2020. On this occasion, we have been talking with cooperative leaders from around the world, and today we are very happy to have join us Jean-Louis Bancel. He is the president of COOP France. He is the president of Cooperatives Europe and vice president for Europe for the International Cooperative Alliance. Bonjour Jean-Louis.
Bonjour Simel.
Bienvenue.
Merci.
Jean-Louis, you come from a long line of French cooperative leaders that have inspired also the work and guided the work of the ILO on cooperatives and wider social and solidarity economy. Could you tell us about your background and how you first got involved in cooperatives and mutuals?
Okay, thank you so much, Simel, for remembering those important persons. And I especially want to pay a tribute to the first Director General of the ILO, who has been a very, very important person in the French cooperative movement. At the time, at the beginning of the previous century, where the consumer co-op movement in France was very, very strong. So I'm not at their level, but I believe it is important our country, through different persons, and I could be maybe one of these persons, could be active in promoting the cooperative spirit within the ILO, with the help of the ILO, and of course, among all people living on Earth. So my background did not start directly with the COOPs. Okay, I was born many years ago now, 65 years ago, in France, in Paris. I've been brought up in Paris, but my parents were civil servants. They were working for the tax system, okay? And my two grandfathers were also tax persons, okay? So it's a long tradition of civil service in my family. So I went to school and different positions in learning, and I started being a civil servant, even if I thought when being young that I would never do that. But when I was 18, I thought serving the general interest is something worthy. So I started there, and in fact, I didn't know that something had some influence on me, not only my vision of the world. I believe it has a huge influence on what my parents told me, but in fact, they were themselves very much involved in something which is important in the French system, which are health mutuals. So when joining the French Treasury and Ministère des Finances, we all, at that time at least, we all were members of a mutual, a health mutual, Mutuelle Centrale des Finances. I joined this mutual as just a member, but now, but I will explain later on, I'm the chair, the president of this mutual, the mutual was taking care of all the people, the civil servants working for the finance ministry in France. So, in fact, my first by-side knowledge of co-ops movement was through mutuals. So I'd been working in different positions in the French administration on different topics, the trade in the insurance sector, in surveillance of the insurance sector, in the tradings for the equities on watchdog every time, on the consumer protection. And for Africa, I've been in charge of Africa when I was in the French Treasury for the development of this continent. So I spent wonderful years there, 15 years. And the people from the insurance mutuals, they came and asked me if I would agree to join them in their trade body, which name was at that time GEMA, which is a Groupement des Entreprises Mutuelles d'Assurance. And those institutions are very important in France. They represent 60% of the insurance market for retail activity, with huge mutuals, with millions of people being members, such as Massif, Maïf, GMF, and others. So I went with them, and there I started being involved. That was in '93. I started being involved indirectly. I didn't know exactly at that time what it meant with the international cooperative movement, which was and which is the International Cooperative Insurance Mutual, Cooperative and Mutual Insurance Federation, ICMIF. ICMIF has been created in '92, at the end of '92. I joined January the 1st, '93, and I was involved with an important person who was the first CEO of ICMIF, Hans Dahlberg. Hans Dahlberg is a Swedish person. He had been the CEO of Folksam, an important Swedish mutual, and he had left this position, and he had moved to Altrincham, which is close to Manchester, where the headquarters of the ICMIF is, and he started working. So I was one of the first to go there to Manchester. That was at that time in '93, Manchester was still on a turning point from the old industrial city to this vibrant new city it is now. And we started working on building up the ICMIF. And something which is important to understand, the insurers, the cooperative insurers decided to create ICMIF, cutting from the ICA, because in '92, there has been a Congress, an ICA Congress in Tokyo. I wasn't there, but it was very close. I've been told what happened there. In fact, inside the ICA, there was a huge discussion on that questions. Are mutuals co-ops or not? And one of the factors to decide to split at that time was the question of the capital sharing, because in the mutuals, you have no shares, okay? You are a member, but you don't bring some money inside the system. So the classical vision of the co-ops was, okay, no, not at all. We can't mix with mutuals. That was one reason. The other one was, of course, inside the mutual, there are some fake mutuals, okay? But like in the cooperative movement, there are some fake co-ops, okay? So we decided to create the ICMF. I went into the system, but we still kept relations with the ICA. And that was the reason why when 25 years ago, there was a Congress in Manchester for the ICA where the cooperative identity was adopted. I was there 25 years ago. And that's interesting because, in fact, by joining the mutual movement, French movement, I didn't thought I would join the cooperative movement. Why was it so? Because you have to understand that something very important but sad happened in the French cooperative movement a bit earlier, at the end of the 70s, early 80s. It was the major economic collapse of the French coop mutuals, okay? what was the reason for this collapse, this failure? It was because they didn't see the coming train of the supermarket, hypermarkets, and so on. So the co-ops at that time, they were small, tiny shops close to the people, but very, very old-fashioned. And in fact, when the supermarket developed and spread out, in fact, the system collapsed. And that's another thing to understand. In collapsing, they also collapsed an important structure, which was their bank, Credit Cooperative. At that time, it was not called Credit Cooperative, okay? But the bank was so much supporting the consumer co-op movement that, in fact, we were broke. And so the Credit Cooperative was resettled, should I say, financially resettled, thanks to the French Minister of Finance of that time, whose name was Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who later on became our president. So you see, that's the way I came in the cooperative movement, by the side, or should I say by the outside. So I believe the way I went in the cooperative movement just drew my attention of, first, we have to be careful of finding allies for the cooperative movement. The worst would be just to be closing doors and windows, just believing we're the best and nothing can teach us anything. And secondly, we have to accept that from the outside and even from the inside, there are some questions or even more aggressive way of asking, are you sure the way you do things are still in the cooperative spirit? So maybe it was a bit long, but I thought it was interesting to understand on the way I went into the cooperative system, should I say. It was not drawn by heritage. It was not drawn by any Holy Spirit that I should become what I am now in this movement.
From civil servant to mutuals and then cooperative movement. In fact, thank you for mentioning Albert Thomas, the first director of the ILO, a French cooperative leader. And we had also three very important French cooperative thinkers, practitioners, as my predecessors, as chiefs of co-op, and I would like to mention them in the same spirit. Georges Fauquet, of course, was the first one. Maurice Colombin was another one. And then Jean-Baptiste Orizet, a third one. These were very instrumental, not only for the work of the ILO on cooperatives, but also with their thinking on cooperatives and wider social economy. In fact, I remember meeting you as president of Credit Cooperative, and when you were supporting a number of important initiatives in developing the ecosystem for social and solidarity economy in the Mediterranean, especially the south of the Mediterranean. And I remember fondly the late president of Massif, Gerard André, you had come together. Could you tell us a little bit of your thinking in reaching out to the Mediterranean and supporting this form of organization enterprise in the Mediterranean basin?
Okay, with pleasure. I think the most important value we have to promote in the cooperative movement is solidarity. Close solidarity or remote solidarity. And we have to acknowledge something which is important. In fact, the cooperative movement has been very much helped by globalization. But since some people are questioning the future of globalization, does that mean that it's going to be hard times for COOPs? I think we have to go back to something which is important, and that has been the reason for founding 125 years ago the International Cooperative Alliance, which is internationalism. Okay, it means COOPs or cooperators are actors in their communities, but we are citizens of the world. And if ever we go back on the reason why after the First World War the ILO was created, and when you go back to the work that was done by the first Director General, Albert Thomas, I'm very much involved in Cerisy, which is a place where Albert Thomas has been very active. That's what he always pledges on multilateralism. The citizens of the world should be acting for peace and for solidarity to really go forward. So we have to take into account what's going on in different parts of the world. First, close to our community, inside our communities, close to our own nation first, of course, and of course, there, whichever countries, even my own country, is the question of the rising inequalities among people. So that's first thing where solidarity has to act. The other one is, of course, international solidarity, which is not only on humanitarian activities, which is important, but much more, what I say, deep-rooted solidarity, how to help the civil society in different countries to play its own role, okay? Not only individuals, but with links between them. So what happened with the Mediterranean countries? When with Gérard Hondrek, as you say, who passed over 2 years ago now, there was what was called the Printemps Arabes, the Arab Spring. Okay, we saw all the youngsters, not only on the south side of the Mediterranean, even the north side, Spain, Italy, and even some places in France. They came out and they decided to resist. And that was interesting. It was starting from in different countries, from different places. And in France, it started with someone who has been very important in my own history, Stéphane Hessel. Stéphane Hessel was, he died, let's say 5 years ago now. He was a very important French ambassador. He has been negotiating for the creation of UN in Geneva. He has been very much active in Geneva for the UN, for the civil rights and the declaration, the UN declaration for the rights, for the human rights. And I had him as a teacher when I was learning to be a civil servant. So he wrote a book which name was Résister. And the youngsters, they went out and they were resisting. That was just after the major financial collapse. But he wrote another book which title was Engagez-vous, engage yourself. And with Gérard Hondrek, we said, okay, we cannot stay sitting where we are without trying to help those young persons on both sides of the Mediterranean Sea. They have to resist for sure, but they have to find a way to engage themselves, to change the things that are happening in their surroundings. So this is the way we started. We started this structure, which name is MEDES, Méditerranée Économie Sociale, and we created a financial tool for that, which name is COOP Med, which is, okay, Cooperative pour la Méditerranée. And I remember very well, we had a first event in Tunis just a few weeks after the upcoming of the events. And everyone was telling us, don't go there. It's very, very dangerous. And it was so wonderful to see how much the young generations, all they want is just to build a better now and a brighter future. So it was a start. It's still, okay, it will take time, but it goes on, it goes on. We need to have hope, and that's what we try to bring. So thanks to everyone, and the ILO is part of that, of this movement, slowly, but for sure, the civil society is taking its role in these countries.
And in fact, Tunisia has just adopted the Tunisian parliament, the social economy legislation. That's policy. That's a very important step.
That's important, but it's not everything. You know,
no.
We are in a country where we like to vote for legislation, but the most important is a good framework, for sure, a good public policy, but also actors to be sustained, to be backed. And so it is important to cope, to help them, to back them on this process. So it's a good first step.
Yeah.
Still going on in other countries.
Yeah. The proof is in the pudding, you're saying. The yes, implementation of the policy will be very important, and the institutions be needed to make that policy work. You mentioned the statement on cooperative identity. It's 25 years since its adoption. I was wondering, how is, in your view, the changing world of work influencing co-op identity in terms of new types of cooperatives, like multi-stakeholder maybe, or new sectors where we see cooperativism emerging, like platform economy. If you have some thoughts on this dynamics around the change.
For sure, I believe that something which was very important happened in Manchester 25 years ago, which we were not aware of, by setting this cooperative identity. In fact, we didn't thought that we were in fact changing the vision that co-opters had on co-ops. Because if ever you turn back to the history, I'm very fond of history. If ever you turn back to the history of the ICA and the cooperative movement, what do you see? First, that in the second half of the 19th centuries, co-ops were spreading out, surging out in different countries, and most important, in different fields. Because for a long time, ICA was only the federation or the alliance for consumer co-ops. But in fact, worker co-ops, birthplace is France, okay? Credit co-ops, it's Germany. Agriculture co-ops is different countries. But ICA at that time was much more the gathering of consumer co-ops. Okay, there was some room for the worker co-ops because it has been part and it is part of the French history, okay? But that's really interesting because there has been long fights, should I say, discussions between consumer co-ops and worker co-ops on the question of the price. Okay, should we pay more whenever we consume products coming from cooperative worker factories? And that's the reason why the fixed principle, which is intercooperation in between co-ops, was created, telling we shouldn't fight against each other in between consumer co-ops and worker co-ops. So that was the beginning of trying to set an agreement in between co-ops. No one is better than the other one. So what is the next step brought by the work adopted in Manchester? It's a very broad and common definition of co-ops, whichever sector you work in. It's not by the legal form, it's not by the question of the shareholding of the capital. It's not by that, it's by values and principles. And that has been the start for the ICA and the cooperative movement to think, yes, what we have in common is much more important than the slightly difference we have between banks, agriculture, and so on. There are differences for many good reasons, but this is not the most important. So that's the first thing. ICA, by adopting through the Congress of Cooperators, not of Cooperatives, adopting this vision, very, very even view, ICA was pushed to come out from this idea of, let's say, consumer co-ops are on the top to very slowly turn into something. Of course, there was this accident with the insurance sector, and that's mostly because Pauline Green, when she has been elected the president, very much pushed on that. Okay, ICA and the identity are bringing a universal vision of co-ops. Universal doesn't mean uniform. That's something which is important because, and that's the most difficult. How can we be universal and respect diversity, which is always difficult, but whatever. So it went on, and slowly new forms of co-ops appeared. First thing which is important is co-ops of trade entities, because now in developed country, in the north, most important co-ops are not individual co-ops, are co-ops of enterprise, okay? Should there be craftsmen? Should there be, okay, different independent workers and so on? So that will turn back to that question you raised on the future of work. So first, we have to understand, especially in France, that more than 50% in economic weight of the co-ops are trade, industrial co-ops. It means they are not individual members, they are indirect members. So that's a huge influence. Second thing which appeared, which is very important, is why should we be still specialized since the world is changing? And especially the value change is moving. An example I want to give is agriculture. Agriculture co-ops, they were at the beginning farmer co-ops, but they are not anymore only farmer co-ops. They are agriculture co-ops. It means that they move from caring from the crops of the farmers to buying out their grains, their production, and transforming them and then turning them into food. So that's interesting. And that changed the vision. It's not only protecting the small individual farmer, it's turning to the enterprise of farming, or betterment even, it's nourishing people, okay? And the third one was, of course, was why should we restrain to only one sector? Why don't we try to gather different visions? And the good example is what we call in French, Société Coopérative d'Intérêt Collectif, SIC, which are gathering, okay, producer, workers, users, and so on. That's very interesting because it opens the question of co-ops being served at the service of public utilities. That's something which is not considered enough by the cooperative movement. But we have to understand that in many countries or in many places, in fact, the public services, the utilities are served by co-ops. If ever you look at electricity, for example, who knows that in United States, in the rural areas, when after the 29, the Great Depression, what Roosevelt decided is to electrify, to turn out the rural areas into better by electrifying, and it is still provided by co-ops. If ever you look at South America, in many countries in South America, utilities are provided by co-ops, okay? It's not only, it shouldn't be only a legal form, it's the way of processing. So you see, that's interesting, the new multi-stakeholder co-ops. It means something very important because it's maybe more difficult in governing the institution to converge all the interests. So I believe it demands much more from the managers, but that's the important thing. And the last but not the least is, of course, the question of the social co-ops. And that was very much well defined at the beginning by Italian colleagues. Not only them, but they have been at the forefront. And that's interesting because why did it came out? It came out because for many different reasons, we have seen the slowdown of the welfare state, okay? That's why it's so close to the question of utilities, okay? In, let's say, after the Second World War till, let's say, the 70s, in many countries, they thought that the real socialism by state would bring everything. And in fact, it didn't. And in fact, in some countries, who provided some social services, new forms of co-ops. So that's an important future for the cooperative movement. And that's what opened the doors to what is called social economy, okay? And in fact, it's still moving on. So you see, from this beginning of consumer co-ops by spreading out, it's like a huge, wonderful painting, okay? The cooperative movement. This is why what the ILO has been working on, the future of work, not the future of people as salaries, but as workers. Whatever the statutes you have, you still work. Even in social work, you work, okay? It's not because you are not paid through wages, classical wages, that you're not a worker. So I believe it is important we've been involved and will still be involved in all these different areas, classical co-ops, okay, multi-stakeholder co-ops, utilities co-ops, or even social co-ops. So you see, there is plenty, and I know you are not enough in your unit, to do that. I'm going to pledge for you.
Thank you, Jean-Louis. As the president of Cooperatives Europe and vice president of ICA for Europe, what are the priorities of the co-op movement for the next 10 years as it relates to advancing the sustainable development goals? We are marking this year, the UN General Assembly is going on, the 5th anniversary of these goals. And yeah, if you would be so kind to share with us the thinking, the state of the art on that from the co-op.
First, as the chair of Cooperative Europe, there is one vision, which is chaired by the board and I think by the members. Europe, in the meaning it has for us, geographically, not EU, Europe, including Russia and Turkey, of course, and other European countries. Europe is, and not only was, is the cradle of co-ops. That's something which I believe is important. Yes, Europe has played an important role in history, and that is why, for the co-ops, this is why it has been the cradle, but it is still. So when I was explaining about the social co-op, the utilities co-ops and so on, that's what I mean by being a cradle, and still a living cradle. It means ideas pops out, and it is important to keep in mind that the cooperative identity adopted in Manchester, which is in universal, okay, very much maybe influenced, maybe someone would say too much influenced by the European ideas. Still, Europe has a huge role to play to be a vivid cradle. It doesn't mean that the other continents don't have their role. They have to be engaged and we have to collaborate each other. But that's the first idea. Yes, Europe is still to be engaged in the process. For the SDGs, it's the same. Okay, what do I mean when I say that? Whenever you look at the values which are at the forefront of the cooperative identity, okay, it is important to understand that solidarity inside mankind is very important. But maybe we have been moving on, and especially, of course, on the question of the climate change and, of course, what I would call the future of mankind. And what happened is when the SDGs were adopted, of course, the cooperative movement said, okay, they are for us, okay, but you have to understand, or the people listening to us have to understand something, that the question of the seventh principle is very important. So everyone knows what is the seventh principle. It is a principle that was brought in Manchester, is caring for the community. So it might be looked at on different ways. It might be looked at very local, caring for my local community. But that's not the only meaning it has. It might be the global community, which is Earth or mankind. So it is important to understand that when the ICA had a General Assembly in Mexico, in Cancun, a few years ago, our colleagues from South America, they wanted to change the seventh principle in introducing environment question. And I was one of the people on the room, being a delegate, telling, I do agree with what you want to do, but it's not the process we should keep going on. Because in my vision that was shared by the General Assembly, the principles are like a constitution. You cannot change by just voting a resolution like something beginning. You have to take very good consideration. So it was decided that the vision pushed by the Brazilians and the South American was important, but we could not change very swiftly the rules. So we said, okay, we're going to set a group we're going to work on this topic. That was the question of the Principles Committee. I had been chairing it, and we published guidelines. And we very much focused on this seventh principle. And there we said, okay, at that time, the SDGs, they were on discussion. And we said, okay, that's for us. We have to grab them, okay? So we have to understand there are 70 targets, global targets. Each individual COPs cannot maybe handle all those strategic targets, but at least we could take one or two and decide to be involved in. And it is important we grab this question. So the last thing that comes to my mind considering this question is, now everyone is pretending to take care of those SDGs, whichever type of activities they have, whichever type of enterprise they are in. So for us COPs, it means that we cannot be only telling things. We have to tell things, but we have to demonstrate that there is no gap in between what we tell and what we do, what we practice. So, you know, that's in my vision, something which is very important at stake. Inside the cooperative movement, we have to find ways to demonstrate that our COPs is really coping with the aims that we collectively said are ours. For example, in my country, in France, we pushed, and the legislation has been changed for what is called cooperative audit. Every 5 years, we have to present to our General Assembly an outside report telling, do you cope with the principle, the cooperative principle, in action, and in the future, that will be extended to some chosen SDGs. So you see, that's something which is important, not only pledging for good things, but showing, demonstrating that we're really acting for that.
You mentioned, Jean-Louis, Principle 6, concern for community. You also...
Seven.
Yes, 7.
6 intercooperation.
6 is cooperation among cooperatives. And you also mentioned the importance of institutions, the ecosystem of institutions supporting the growth and thriving of cooperatives and wider social economy. I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on the role of social finance in creating or contributing to such a conducive ecosystem for cooperatives and other social and solidarity economy institutions. You were also the chair, served as the chair of the International Cooperative Banking Association. So what do you think is that role for social finance?
So I'm a banker. I've been an insurer. I'm still an insurer. I'm a banker too. And I believe we cannot say that per se money is not good, okay? Money is a tool that has been invented by man for service to mankind. So the first thing is, whenever I read such trenchings as money is not good, money is evil, it's just created by man. It's not coming out from the sky, okay? Even if huge amount of money are coming now from the central banks, the concept of money has been created by mankind. So we have to find a way to make sure that money is still a tool at the service of people. This is why in my bank, but not only in my bank, in my country, and even on a wider basis, we have been so much engaged in the concept of social finance. It started many years ago when, at that time, it was very fashionable, microfinance, okay? It was a UN summit in Halifax that's spread out this idea. And microfinance can be useful. It depends on what you do with it, okay? Whatever you finance. But so we created this concept of social finance, and Credit Cooperative, which I share, has been the leader in France, in Europe, in sharing finance, in social finance. Of course, we are looking on what's going on inside the classical black box of the bank. This is why, in my vision, cooperative co-ops are maybe well placed to be actors there. That's the first thing. Secondly, then it's slowed to the question of impact finance. So now we are very much involved in this. So the question mostly is to be clear on what is said, what is done. We know that some people, they are just using this concept of social finance or impact finance just for claiming. And there is a wide gap between what they say and what they do. But it's not because some people are sitting that we should drop out this question. So it is important that some people, such as the Fédération Européenne des Banques Éthiques Alternatives, which was created by Credit Coop, or GABV, Global Alliance for Banking on Values, created by Triodos and other banks around the world, which we are a member of, still goes on. We have to use the intelligence of people. Okay, I know it's a time of fake news, of rumors, of pretending that everyone is cheating. No, it's not true. Some people, they have good intentions, and okay, they have to demonstrate that they cope with what they say, but social finance is very useful. This is why we created, for example, a fund which name is COPEST, which was at that time a fund created to help financial institutions in the eastern part of Europe. And for example, we're involved in microfinance in Kosovo, for example. Okay, could give other example. This is why we created COPMED, which I mentioned, or for example, we created Helios, which was pushed by Maria Novak, the former, the founder and the former chair of ADI, Association d'aide à l'initiative individuelle, which is trying to spread out around Europe and emerging countries this idea of social finance. So there has been some bad examples, for sure. We know about microfinance, what happened in Mexico, what happened in India, but it's not because there is sometimes a rotten fruit that you stop eating cherries, okay? You have to be careful in the way you pick up the cherries, but that's what I want to pledge for social finance and the cooperative movement to be involved in.
Jean-Louis, we are commemorating the 75th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations this year, and ILO has, of course, been around since 1919. What do you think is the relation of these international organizations to the promotion and advancement of cooperatives and wider social and solidarity economy?
What I would call the building up of a worldwide international civil society. If ever you go back to the founding of the ILO after the First World War, what was the idea? Never again the war, okay? And what was the idea? We cannot only rely on the governments. We never know what might happen. What came out, and it even started before with the Red Cross, okay? It's first resisting, okay? Never again. And we need, in the international game, multi-stakeholders players. This is why the ILO was created with these three components, okay? And we even know that at that time, some people were thinking a fourth component of COPs might have been useful. Okay, this is history. And what is important in the ILO process? It's the governments, the states, but, okay, le patronat, okay, the employers on one side, and the trade unions, the workers. So that's the beginning of what I would call international civil society, okay? And that's interesting because it's the building up of this civil society, which is also later on involved in the UN through the Conseil économique et social, the social and economic council of the UN, which in which the ICA is member, is recognized as such. So, and what you see going up through the demonstration for the climate and so on, the push of the worldwide opinion, pushing the governments, pushing the states to move forward, to take care of mankind and hers. So something which has been very important is when the ILO has adopted its position on the cooperative movement. It was a recognition by this institution built up with this international civil society of the role of a component of the civil society, which are COOPs, okay? And that's very important because I believe, but that's my vision of the world, that in fact, in the future, the public opinion, the international public opinion, is getting more and more important in adopting or adapting the international legislation. So some legislation, they are tough legislation, others are, okay, very soft legislation, whatever. Slowly, we're building up an legal environment. If ever you would ask the state, they would limit this. So this is why I believe there is this huge trend. And of course, it's not surprising that in some countries, they want to dismantle the multilateralism. It's not a question of multilateralism. It's a question of the public opinion, okay? They care. I'm not addressing any specific countries, but everyone do understand who I'm looking at on the other side of the Atlantic, of course, but he's not the only one, okay? Is they take care of the public opinion. No, they take care of their opinion and they pretend it is the public opinion. No, the public opinion is a real public opinion in its diversity. We have to acknowledge there is diversity. So I believe things are moving on. Sometimes it's going faster, and sometimes after the First World War, the Second World War, we so much discover how much we need that. And later on, it slows down, and there's even some backlashes sometimes. But that's really what I'm convinced of. We have to keep going on this train. It's very Frenchy. It's very on the ideas of the French philosophers of the 18th centuries, okay, Enlightenment and so on. But I believe this is a trend, the good trend for the future.
We are having this interview during the first day of fall of 2020, and this year has been marked by a global pandemic, COVID-19, that has further exacerbated global inequalities. How are cooperatives and wider social economy responding to this? Are they ready, able to respond to the challenges that are rising with the effects of this pandemic? What do you think?
It's not a preset answer. It's really hard. And first, I believe cooperatives are very much deep-rooted in their communities, in their local economy, and so on. So when we had the financial crisis of 2009, I remember we had a work on cooperative banks with the ILO on that matters. What we said, it was a financial crisis at a first stage. Co-ops were not concerned, even the cooperative banks, because they were deep-rooted in real economy. But that time, this sanitary crisis is turning to an economic crisis. So co-ops are on the front row, and even cooperative banks are being affected by this. So the way we can answer, and we try to answer, is first through solidarity. It means that, of course, first solidarity with the workers, solidarity with the members, and sometimes by not asking the members to pay the amount that was supposed to be paid, and so on and so on. But it can also affect the future of some co-ops. So I know that some co-ops are in bad shape, and that's a concern. And of course, the problem is it's so spread out. We cannot say, okay, it's not like a natural disaster. When this happened in one country, we can say, okay, we're going to send some money to help this country, or okay, but it's all over. So it's not easy. The first thing is maybe to talk to each other more. That's the ICA, what the ICA is trying to do. Trying to understand what are the solutions built up by different countries and so on, and at least to give our solidarity. We know it's not by sending money. Some co-ops are in very bad economic shape, but at least to give them moral support and telling them that whichever way we could use it, we can try to help them. So that's a tremendous challenge for everyone. And it's so important to have this belief that cooperative values are the hard rock we can lie on. Is very important. Okay.
That is a hopeful note, Jean-Louis. It's always inspiring to talk to you. Thank you so much for making the time to mark this occasion of the co-op service of the ILO for the last 100 years, and look forward to meeting you in good days, face to face.
Me too. It was a real pleasure to talk to you and, of course, to talk to everyone through this way, and hope to see you in person as soon as possible. Goodbye to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.